All right, welcome everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. So hello, my name is Margot Irvin, and I am the acquisitions editor here at Stanford University Press. I manage our Asian America series, our long-running series under the series editorship of Professor Gordon Chang. And I'm thrilled that today we have the opportunity to gather in this context and highlight the latest book in the series, which is Caroline Yang's wonderful book, The Peculiar Afterlife of Slavery, The Chinese Worker and the Minstrel Form. So this is actually the very last book that I got an advance copy of back when we were still in the office, when that was a thing before we went into shelter in place. And while we are certainly living in a very different world now, I think that the way that Caroline's book historicizes and theorizes anti-blackness and anti-Chinese racism has something really important to contribute to the current discourse. So I'm really happy we have the opportunity to discuss the book today, and thank you to everyone who's here joining us, and thank you to the AAAS for organizing this virtual book fair. Caroline, it has been such a pleasure working with you on this, and I'm so glad that the book is now out there in the world and generating conversations. And today we are also joined by Esther Kim Lee. So thank you, Esther, for agreeing to be in conversation with Caroline today. Before we dive into it, I'll just give a quick rundown of how today's event is going to work. So we plan to go for about an hour or so. First, Caroline is going to give a brief introduction to the book, and next we will have Caroline and Esther in conversation. We want to leave about 15 minutes at the end for Caroline and Esther to take questions. So during the course of the event, you may begin to pose questions for the Q&A portion. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A option. So you can submit questions through there, and then we will be routing them to Caroline and Esther when we get to the Q&A portion. Just a reminder to everyone that this is being recorded and will be available later on. So before we launch into it, or before Caroline launches into it, I will just read some brief introductions. So Caroline Yang is Associate Professor of English at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, where she teaches Asian American and African American literatures using the framework of critical race studies. The Peculiar Afterlife of Slavery is her first book, and her other writings can be found in Modern Fiction Studies, Melis, the Journal of Asian American Studies, and the volume Asian American Literature in Transition, 1850 to 1930. Esther Kim Lee is Professor of Theater Studies and the International Comparative Studies program at Duke University. She is the author of A History of Asian American Theater, which received the 2007 award for Outstanding Book given by the Association for Theater and Higher Education. She is the editor of 7 contemporary plays from the Korean diaspora in the Americas and just completed her term as the chief editor of Theater Survey, the flagship journal of the American Society for Theater Research. Her latest published book is The Theater of David Henry Hwang, and she's currently working on a much anticipated monograph on the history of yellowface in the United States. So without further ado, Caroline, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Margot. Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be here and to be able to share my work with you today and to connect with you in this way. I want to thank AAAS and my dream team at Stanford University Press, my amazing editor, Margot, Melina, Stephanie, and Kendra for giving me this opportunity to present my work and share my work with not just my colleagues and friends in academia, but also family and friends who normally don't see me in action like this. And I'm truly, truly grateful to all of you for logging in today and tuning in. And this really feels like a celebration. So thank you. As Margot mentioned, I will begin with a brief introduction, followed by a conversation with Esther, whose work has been so important to my own scholarship and teaching. I'm very grateful and honored that she could participate in this event today. So let me now share my screen. And begin. So in the 1870s, back when people not only actually read poems, but even memorized them, the most popular poem in the United States was called Plain Language from Truthful James by Bret Harte. It was set in a mining camp in California and was about two white miners who tried to cheat a Chinese worker in a card game, but end up getting cheated themselves. It was published out of San Francisco in a journal that Hart edited, but was quickly reprinted in newspapers all across the country, and people just couldn't get enough of it. In today's language, it went viral. It was turned into standalone chapbooks, illustrated chapbooks, and set to music and reprinted many times as a songbook. As you can see along the way, the poem became better simply known as the Heathen Chinese because of this repeated stanza describing the Chinese worker or the Chinese character. For ways that are dark and the tricks that are vain, the heathen Chinese is peculiar. My book, The Peculiar Afterlife of Slavery, argues that it is imperative to contextualize the wild popularity of Hart's poem in the historical period that we know as Reconstruction after the Civil War. It asks, what does it mean that the most popular poem written during Reconstruction was about a Chinese worker? Hart's poem at the height of Reconstruction in 1870, just months after US Congress passed the Naturalization Act of 1870. The original Naturalization Act from 1790 had granted citizenship only to free white persons. So at issue was the decisive question of how to phrase the law after emancipation that would define who could become American. Charles Sumner, a Republican senator from Massachusetts, proposed that they revise the law by getting rid of the word white, so that, he said, in naturalization, there shall be no distinction of race or color. Sumner called this moment a golden opportunity for the nation to move away from racism after the abolition of slavery. But the proposal did not pass, and this golden opportunity was lost forever. And the reason for that was that the lawmakers believed that making naturalization race neutral would open the floodgates for the Chinese to become citizens. They used the rhetoric that the Chinese were heathens and slaves and intrinsically incapable of being American or free. Important to note here is that the word heathen was used during slavery to describe enslaved Black people in order to justify their condition of enslavement. During Reconstruction, the word was used jointly with the word slave to refer to Chinese workers to justify their exclusion. By coining the term heathen Chinese, Hart's poem cemented this connection between the word heathen and the Chinese, which was ultimately part of the logic that led up to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, just 5 years after the end of Reconstruction, and which stipulated that the Chinese could not become US citizens. This law was extended to other Asians and was not repealed until 1943. Here we have to ask, okay, but why was Hart's poem such a huge sensation? It was because people thought it was hilarious. And this gaze that saw the Chinese character as so comical needs to be understood in the context of the most popular form of 19th century American culture, which was Blackface Minstrelsy, or white caricatures of what it means to be Black. In particular, in my chapter on Hart, which opens the book, shows how deeply he was influenced by one of the most iconic minstrel figures in US literature. This is the character of Topsy from Uncle Tom's Cabin, who is referred to multiple times in the novel as a heathen or heathenish. Even though no one would think of Uncle Tom's Cabin as comical today, when it was first published, people honed in on the impish prankster character of Topsy and thought she was outrageously funny. And you can kind of see a trend here, right? So the depictions that we think of, that we see as monstrous and dehumanized depictions of people of color were seen as hilarious. And that is American humor. Topsy also had a catchphrase in the novel, "Eyes so wicked," which became a song performed on the minstrel stage and was used to sell products like tobacco. Topsy's self-proclaimed propensity for sinfulness is mirrored in Hart's character, Ah Sin, whose name could be a play on word on a sin or I sin. You'll have to read my book for more evidence for the connections between Ah Sin and Topsy. But what the point here is that just as lawmakers used the racial language from slavery to talk about the Chinese during Reconstruction, Hart's poem relied on representational practices from slavery to construct its Chinese character. Connecting the most popular poem and the most popular novel published in the 19th century United States then is Blackface Minstrelsy, the ubiquitous form of representing Blackness and race during and after slavery. Through the repeated labels of heathen and peculiar, the latter calling to mind the euphemism for slavery as the peculiar institution, Hart's poem displaces the word peculiar from the institution of slavery to the figure of the Chinese worker. And this served to further the justification for slavery's existence in the first place, that non-white, specifically Black people were naturally unfree and incapable of freedom. For the Chinese during Reconstruction, this meant that their exclusion and acts of violence against them were thought to be deserving, as we can see in all the illustrations accompanying the poem, where anti-Chinese violence is celebrated. And if the Chinese were thought to be deserving of exclusion, African Americans were often depicted at this time as undeserving of their freedom, as seen in this poster mocking the Freedmen's Bureau and freed Black people. Both of these depictions happened through the minstrel form, which originated in slavery and depicted Black people as supposedly enjoying their condition of dehumanization and enslavement. After slavery, the minstrel form lived on, not just in the caricatured representations of Black people as lampooned comical entertainers, but also in performances of Chineseness inspired by the heathen Chinese. In this way, Hart's poem and the cultural phenomena it unleashed exemplify the process through which the anti-Black racial logic of slavery remained meaningful through the minstrel form and the Chinese worker. My book seeks to make visible that process by showing how anti-Black racism was recalibrated, not dismantled, through the non-Black Chinese worker in US literature in the long afterlife of slavery. Thank you. And
thank you, Caroline. Hello, everybody. I see that we have over 50 people attending. This is really incredible. And thank you, Caroline, for the invitation to speak with you about your wonderful book. I've known you and about your work for many, many years. We go way back to University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, when you were a postdoc there. And I know that this project has changed somewhat since the time you were working on your project as a postdoc at UIUC. So can you tell us a bit about how the project was conceived and what led you to the project that we have now in the book form?
Sure. And yeah, thank you again, Esther, for participating in this with me. This is like dream come true to be able to talk about my book with you. So I don't want to go too far back, but I became interested in Asian American studies in grad school. But it wasn't until I read W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America that I kind of got a sense of like my own project and what I wanted to research. And that ultimately became my dissertation. And I want to just say a brief word about Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, because it really kind of opened my eyes. I think every academic must have a book or two that's kind of life-altering, and that book was that for me. It really made me understand the significance of Reconstruction, and in fact, Du Bois says that the unending tragedy in the United States is that Americans don't understand the significance of Reconstruction. And I think what he was saying is that Reconstruction was kind of this golden opportunity, to use Sumner's words, for the United States to fully reckon with what slavery had been. And slavery wasn't just about labor exploitation. Slavery was a system that turned human beings into things to be bought and sold. And for the United States to fully reckon with that, the 12 years of the actual Reconstruction was not going to be enough. And it really, I mean, so many things that it's a very long book, so he says a lot in it. And so many things he says in the book were really eye-opening. For example, he asks, you know, why were like poor white people not aligning themselves with with the enslaved Black people, right? What did they have to gain? They couldn't afford to own enslaved people themselves. And he talks about the psychological wage of whiteness, which I think is still very much relevant today to think about. And it's this idea of kind of clinging to race, right, as a justification for why someone is better. So instead of kind of seeking solidarity and alliance through class lines, white people held on to their racial superiority or the belief in white supremacy. And we see that today too in some of the most kind of rampant anti-Black and anti-immigrant racism among working class white people. Who kind of, you know, see themselves more aligned with this idea of whiteness than with like working people's solidarity, for example. So Du Bois's book was so influential in that way, but he only sees race kind of in terms of Black and white. And there's no mention of the Chinese worker. And I mean, there are very few, but not anything significant. So I wanted to kind of explore that a little bit more. Because during Reconstruction, if you look through the congressional records, the Chinese question was just all over. And like, you know, my presentation kind of hinted at, the most influential literary writers were writing about the Chinese, mostly out of California at this time. So I wanted to kind of put together this, I guess, absence in Black Reconstruction with what was going on in literature. So that was kind of the trajectory of the dissertation and the book. Oh, I think you're
Sorry.
mute.
Yeah, I am sorry. I have to get used to this.
Yeah.
Those of you who joined us late, please, you could enter your question on the Q&A box if you're able to see it. Type that in, and we'll spend the last about 15 minutes of today's session addressing some of those questions. So I invite you to type in your questions while we're talking. Yeah, so I think one of the things that we academics have to do, especially in sessions like this, when you have such a wide range of participants and people are watching, and I see many familiar names, and they're ranging from artists to graduate students to, so I think it is important for us to make our work transparent, that we don't just go into some random room and come up with a book. It's not how it works. So making our writing process and research process transparent is, I think, very important for us academics to communicate and to be able to express and articulate what that's like. So in that vein, could you talk a little bit about some of the surprising turns and discoveries that you made while you're researching the book and also the writing process?
Yeah, I love how you phrase that. And you are actually a really huge part in it because, in kind of really making it true that the writing, even though, it's just my name on the cover, it's really kind of this like collective endeavor. And one of the most kind of pivotal moments in writing the book was in talking to a theater historian, Peter Davis, who I met at your house, Esther. So I was writing this chapter on Ambrose Bierce, and Ambrose Bierce, wrote short stories. He's mostly famous for his Civil War stories, but he wrote this story called The Haunted Valley, and you can just Google it. Everything is public domain, so you can read it. And it's such a bizarre, weird story. And I was working on it for a long time, and there's this phrase in the story called spectacular extravaganza. And I looked it up, and it was a theater term, and I didn't know, quite what it was. So I just happened to have met Peter Davis. And so I emailed him and I asked him what he thought. And I kind of described the story to him. And immediately, well, he told me that it's like this theater, like it's how it sounds, spectacular extravaganza, like using high tech, really elaborate productions. But he also, when I described the story to him, he immediately said, oh, this format sounds like a minstrel show, because it's about, it has two white men and like actually three white men, and they're just kind of like in this conversation, and everything is back and forth, and they're talking about this missing Chinese worker who's been dead for like 5 years when the story starts. And when he said that, it just completely clicked, and I thought, oh wow, yes, it does sound like a minstrel show. So that's when the book writing kind of looked into minstrelsy even more. When it started out as a dissertation, minstrelsy was not a focus. And even when I was writing other chapters too, minstrelsy wasn't a focus either. But once that light was turned on, I mean, like minstrelsy was everywhere. I could not see it. So that was a kind of a breakthrough moment.
Yeah, I know how that's like. I think when you're writing about the 19th century US and talking about race, you cannot not talk about minstrelsy. I mean, it really is everywhere. So I think you made a right turn. As a theater historian, I approve of the change that you made. And so in writing the book, what is one most significant thing that you learned, and what is the kind of main point that you want the readers to take away from it? And I think this is related to one of the questions that M. Kang wrote, and it's really in that same vein. What lessons would you want people to learn from your book to inform our current political and historical moment? So I think that's I just want to include that question because it is something that I've been thinking about. So two parts. One is, what is the most significant thing that you learned? And then second part is, what would you want the reader to take away from it?
Yeah, I think that's Millian. So hi, Millian. Thank you for the question. It's the thing that I learned the most, and that was, I guess, the most kind of meaningful, is what you said, Esther, that blackface minstrelsy is everywhere. If you study 19th century American pop culture, but it's also kind of its afterlife too. That's also important. So this afterlife, the word from my title, comes from Saidiya Hartman's influential work. And I want to actually read what she says. So when she talks about the afterlife of slavery in particular, she says that it's skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment. And she says that Black lives are still imperiled and devalued after emancipation, right? So I think what I took away from writing the book is kind of the really intricate connection between the afterlife of slavery, the continued anti-Black racism after slavery, and the fact that minstrelsy has kind of evolved into all these different ways. So, I mean, we've been seeing a lot of news about minstrelsy, right, in these past few months and years, I guess. Like Tina Fey, for example, like her 30 Rock, featured characters in blackface. I can like list comedians, you know, a long list of comedians who've performed in blackface. Billy Crystal, Sarah Silverman, Jimmy Fallon, it's just to name a few, right? And so it's, I guess what I'm kind of, what I want, you know, for me to remember and for my readers to see is this continuation of slavery in thinking about race and anti-Blackness in forms that might not be so recognizable and that have become kind of normalized as part of everyday American culture. So it's really kind of recognizing the lessons from Reconstruction, right? Du Bois talks about Reconstruction as a splendid failure. And he says it was a splendid failure because it didn't fail where it was expected to fail. And he's talking about the political participation of Black people and political activism. And I think we see that today too. I think kind of recognizing what Saidiya Hartman calls the terror of the mundane in how these ways of thinking about race and slavery have kind of become normalized and accepted as like just common sense is something that I want us to kind of challenge. And also kind of recognize that, you know, like what I said in my presentation, this idea of American humor is really founded on this violence and violence against people of color, particularly Black people. And minstrelsy is America. And it's what has been kind of, you know, inseparable from slavery. And I mean, what would it mean if, what would it have meant if minstrelsy had been outlawed after slavery? What would the world look like today? So those are some of the questions I guess I'd like us to consider.
Yeah, and I'm sure that when you are writing the book, you could not predict what is going on right now, which is we are seeing anti-Asian racism kind of globally, as well as the protest for Black Lives Matter. So there is this connection between, historical connection between anti-Black racism and anti-Asian racism. And you do talk about that in your book. And I wonder if you could talk about the argument that you do make in the book and whether your thoughts have changed or how it has perhaps become more complicated given the current situation that we're in.
Yeah. I think the current situation, especially with COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement, kind of underscore my conclusion, which is that anti-Black racism is ultimately incommensurable to anti-Chinese or anti-Asian racism. And I'm not interested in like oppression Olympics at all. And I'm not interested in kind of, you know, like hierarchizing any kind of victimization or oppression or racism. But I think that the fact that we have an absolute need for a movement like Black Lives Matter really highlights the incommensurability of anti-Black racism in the United States. At the same time, you know, we have a president who calls the pandemic the China virus. And that is kind of like, I mean, I don't understand why that's not causing more outrage. So I think it's the anti-Asian racism and anti-Black racism are kind of incommensurable racisms, right, that need to be kind of studied in conjunction with each other, but ultimately kind of in highlighting their specificities too. Like,
can you explain that a little bit more, what you mean by that, and then like maybe cite an example from the book on how you demonstrate the relationship between the two types of racism?
Yeah, I think the incommensurability of anti-Black racism is something that that really hit me when I was working on the final 2 chapters in the book. And the final 2 chapters in the book discuss 2 mixed race writers. One is Chinese American, and her name is Suisun Far, and she had an English father, white father, and a Chinese mother. And the other author is Charles Chestnut, who could kind of pass as white if he chose. So some people didn't realize that he was Black until he explicitly stated as such. But he's, you know, always identified as an African-American writer. And when I was writing the chapters on those 2 writers, you know, and Suisun Far would kind of talk about her experience as a Chinese American, you know, as a Chinese American identifying woman, and the anti-Asian racism that she would encounter. And that was incommensurable to the anti-Black racism towards Black women, like some of the characters she discusses as well. So I think it's the depictions of Chineseness in minstrelsy, they're absolutely dehumanized as well, but this kind of categorical systemic categorization of Black people as kind of, you know, outside of the category of the human is something that originates in slavery that is not quite comparable to how other racialized groups have been depicted, even though, you know, the Chinese were called slaves and they were excluded. I think that what's separating, you know, Chinese American history and Asian American history from African American history is the historical fact of slavery.
Yeah. There are many wonderful questions. I was just reading all these questions, and we'll get to them. I can't wait to get to some of those questions. So just a couple more, and then we'll move on to the questions from our attendees. So you teach both Asian American literature and African American literature. So in your both kind of research and pedagogy, your approach is comparative. And I think that is something that we need a lot more in our field. So can you talk a little bit about that methodology and how you approach it? What are some of the things that you think about while you're both writing about and teaching Asian American literature, African American literature comparatively?
Yeah, I think that as much as I say that, you know, anti-Black racism is incommensurable, I think that ultimately what I want to kind of strive for is kind of political and social activism, where people of color make a difference, and people of color kind of, you know, empower one another. So that kind of political, I guess, intent is behind the comparative methodology. At the same time, you know, I'm very kind of, I try to be very self-reflexive about my positionality. Asian American woman who, you know, doesn't have the same experiences as an African American woman might have. So it's a constant kind of like checking in of myself and my positionality as I do the work. I think comparative studies is absolutely important, but and I, you know, tell my students this too, we have to always ask why compare. why these two groups. And for me personally, the history of Asian Americans in the United States has been really inseparable from the history of African Americans. So for example, many people already know this, but the most, when I teach Asian American studies classes, the one stereotype that all my students know is of Asian Americans as the model minority. And the term was coined in the 1960s by a sociologist specifically to differentiate Asian Americans from Native peoples and from African Americans. So the idea was that Asian Americans are always hardworking, they don't ask for government handouts, and they're just very quiet and they're good citizens. And so I think, knowing that history is really important. I encourage my students to study Asian American studies, my Asian American students to study Asian American studies, but I don't think that it's helpful if we have it become, this idea of learning about oneself or, having race pride, right? It's really about kind of seeing one's relationality in connection to other people and other people of color.
Yes, that's something that I have to, in my course here, I do have a new Asian American Studies program. And one of the things I say is, this is, you cannot have a complete US history or kind of understanding of US history without all the pieces. So if you don't have Asian American Studies, you don't have a complete picture. And that's something that, of course, like you said, we need to carry to our students and make them understand the relevance and the importance of studying it comparatively. So I'm going to fold in Jennifer Ho's question. Hi, Jennifer. Thank you. We missed you. She left us. This question about teaching. So many of us want to use your book or chapters from your book in teaching in the classroom. So how would we use your book, and what are some of the things that we can do to approach the topic that you're talking about?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. One of my colleagues here in the APA program, Jareen Tan, who teaches at Mount Holyoke, told me that she's assigning my introduction to her Asian American literature class one way. And I kind of forced my colleague, wonderful friend, Asha Nadkarni here into teaching my introduction in her grad seminar too. And I think teaching the introduction for that grad seminar, if I may say so, it was a seminar on methods in American studies. And I think that could have been useful because when I was in grad school, Chandan Reddy, one of my professors, told me, taught us to ask grad students to read generously, which I think is a really valuable lesson, and I hope many of you will read my book generously. And he also taught us to think about ourselves as producers of knowledge. And I know that not every grad student will go on to write a book, but I think kind of thinking about how knowledge gets produced through writing and researching is something really kind of valuable. And Esther, you mentioned earlier about transparency. And so I think that reading the book, not just my book, but any book, as a way to think about, what are the questions that this book is raising, and what are the interventions, and why does this person think that this intervention is necessary? I think those questions are kind of good to ask. I teach a survey course in American literature, and I teach all the authors that that are included in the book. And I think that kind of assigning chapters, for the different authors would be an interesting way to kind of broaden the scope of that author. So for example, I have a chapter on Mark Twain, And, you know, I mean, many people know about Mark Twain's self-professed love of blackface minstrelsy, but maybe that's not so commonly known outside of academia. But kind of thinking about that love of minstrelsy with Mark Twain's kind of writings about the Chinese, I think could really complicate, you know, how we think about him as this kind of like, you know, like Lincoln of literature, which is what he's often called, that he was anti-racist and that he was progressive, but it really makes us kind of understand the narrow scope with which he was writing when he just failed to recognize what it meant for him to kind of say that he loves blackface minstrelsy. And I also talk about his kind of really rampant anti-native racism too. So I think that, I mean, I don't want to call for, I don't know, maybe I do, but I don't think I would be heartbroken if Mark Twain just is like phased out of American literature and other writers of color kind of take his place. But, you know, if he is to be taught and if he is to be written about, then I think, you know, we owe it to ourselves to be critical and to kind of really complicate, you know, his legacy instead of just kind of like, you know, idolizing him as kind of, you know, a liberal figure in American literature. So, you know, teaching the book that way, I think could kind of highlight the complicity of American literature in, you know, racist way of thinking.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Thank you, Caroline. That was great. We have many questions, so I'm going to invite Margot back in, and the two of us are going to manage the Q&A. I think we're going to alternate back and forth because I think it's difficult to read and like listen and all that at the same time. So I'm going to have Margot read a question, I guess. You could select one, the list.
And thank you, Caroline and Esther, for that great discussion. As Esther says, there are a lot of great questions coming in. And if we have more questions than we have time to get to today, we may invite Caroline to answer some of these in a blog post later on as well. So do continue submitting them. So a question from David Rowe, who asks, did your work uncover how American racial discourse on Blackness was negotiated or explored in 19th century Chinese and or Asian American culture? If so, did you find that set the terms of the discussion or any early indications of a distinct Asian or Chinese American racializing?
Wait, can you repeat that question?
Yes, I'm happy to. So did your work uncover how American racial discourse on Blackness was negotiated or explored in 19th century Chinese or Asian American cultures? And, you know, how that may have set the terms of a distinct kind of Asian American racialization?
Okay, so I think David is asking, if I may, is asking if what I uncovered in Asian American writings and Asian American cultural works. And my chapter on Sui Sin Far actually talks about this, even though I'm not saying that Sui Sin Far is like representative of Asian American culture or, you know, Asian American writings. But, you know, back to Esther's question about kind of the incommensurability of the readers, is when I discovered that Sui Sin Far professes a love of vaudeville shows, which is kind of a cousin of Blackface Minstrelsy, which is kind of what Blackface Minstrelsy evolved to. And it was really eye-opening to see that this Asian American writer was engaged and kind of was more in line with the white writers that I talk about in her kind of appreciation for Blackface minstrelsy or kind of like the minstrel form. So while I looking into like Asian American communities or Asian American culture is kind of out of the scope of the book. Just for that chapter, or just in that chapter, I saw Sui Sin Far as kind of not really fully understanding the implications of what it meant that she was really into vaudeville shows, or that she was writing about Black characters in a certain way. But that's a really great question, and maybe something, a research question for a future project or for others to take on. But in terms of the Asian American writings and Asian American communities, that's sort of out of the scope of my project.
Thank you. I'm going to read a question by Sue, I think. This question has to do with form, and that's one of the questions I was hoping to get to as well. So, so I'll just read it. I was really intrigued by your framing of minstrelsy evolving in new and unfamiliar form in the context of the afterlife of slavery. Could you say a bit more about that? That is, what other forms? So can you talk a little bit more about kind of the what you mean by form? And I know some of the chapters you get into kind of the speech and of the Chinese character and such, but and kind of if there's a sense of evolution of the form, what that looks like.
Oh wow, Elda. That's Elda asking that question. That's a tough question. So yeah, I think of form in a really expansive way, like how Caroline Levine talks about it. For me, the form is really kind of inseparable from the structure of slavery. So the minstrel form is, the one that kind of, I guess, like through which slavery lives on. And so the evolution of the minstrel form, I mean, I guess in my book, I stop in the early 20th century when the form kind of evolves in a really interesting way into Black musical comedies. So in my final chapter on Charles Chestnut, I talk about this phenomenon of the COON. It's a derogatory word, so I don't want to say it, but COON songs that were very, so wildly popular at the turn of the 20th century. And many of these songs, and there were kind of like shows as well, were written by African-American artists. And so, and many of those artists got their start in theater through Blackface Minstrelsy. And I kind of see that as kind of a way that Blackface Minstrelsy sort of died down. I mean, not completely, but it kind of gave way to this new form of Black musical comedy, which was also wildly popular. So learning that those songs and shows that we would consider so racist, because they, they have titles like "All Seas Look Alike to Me." Those songs were written by African-American songwriters. And so I think it really complicates the picture of what it meant for Black artists and Black performers to perform in American popular culture when Blackface Minstrelsy was the dominant form. And the kind of the evolution of it at the turn of the 20th century is something that I really had no idea about. And many of those performers, or some of them, performed in yellowface and performed as Chinese or Asians too. And I think it's a really fascinating history of Blackface Minstrelsy that's really like peculiar and bizarre, but also indicative of the peculiar and bizarre world that we live in, that is the United States.
Thanks, Caroline. The next question I'll turn to is actually directed to both of you, from Julia Lee. She says, your work raises so many productive issues surrounding Asian American culture in the 19th century, an area that is sometimes overlooked because of a seeming paucity of cultural productions. So can you talk about why you wanted to focus on Asian American culture in the 19th century, and what can we glean from 19th century Asian American culture that might help us understand contemporary Asian American culture, if anything? And yes, so this is posed to both of you to respond to.
I want to hear Esther's answer to. Hi, Julia. Thank you for
Julia. Hi, Julia. You know, my mind goes to this archival material that I found at Harvard Theater Collection, where I was looking through somebody's scrapbook. As a theater fan, and there was a kind of a pasting of this paper article about Chinese theater artists in Chinatown, and the way they're drawn look like just regular people. It was not caricatured. It was very journalistic, factual. This is what's happening in Chinatown. These are theater artists who are performing in Chinatown. This is about like 1880s. And I to the next page, and then there's a whole nother like representation of Chineseness, but this in this case is kind of minstrelsy caricature and making fun of the Chinese habits. And there can't be any like more difference between the two. Like you turn the page and it's a completely different world of representation. And I think that kind of really extreme kind of representative modes and expression, it really explains a lot of what's going on even today in terms of stereotyping, and why it was that real Asians in the 19th century, say in New York City, in Chinatown, there was that representation of those people could not be reconciled with representation of them in popular culture. So the theatricalizing of real Asian people was so different from just who they were. And for me, I'm interested in the 19th century American culture and also representation of Asians at that time because of this vast differences between the two, and what caused, why was there such gap between those two types of representation? So that's really my entryway to the project. But Julia, I'll tell you more after I'm done with my book. I'm still working on it. So
yeah, that's a really that's really informative to hear too. And for me, I like to ask these like what if questions, and I asked earlier, what if minstrelsy had been outlawed in the United States? And another question, I think, another what if question is, what if Chinese Exclusion Act didn't happen? What if the Chinese were not excluded, and would like Asian American culture and Asian American literature and Asian American history look like? And many people think of Asians as the new immigrants, and many of us are. And many people think that, Asians are like, like the stereotype of the perpetual foreigner, and that Asian American history is relatively new in the United States. But I think understanding the embeddedness of Asian Americans in an important historical moment like Reconstruction and the question of slavery is really important. And in terms of Asian American cultural productions, I think that's something that, it's like a gold mine. I mean, we really need to do more work, I think, to seek them out and study them.
Yes, I like this last question quite a bit. I'm not going to say the name because I'm going to butcher it. My apologies. Can you provide insights on how African-American writers represent Chinese characters, if at all, during the 19th century, and how those writers may have racialized Chinese characters through minstrel forms? I know that in theater, there were Black theater actors who put on yellowface. And I know that Josephine Lee is currently working on that topic. But in terms of writers, have you come across any African-American writers who represent Chinese characters, and whether, comparisons can be made between what they're doing as opposed to like somebody like Mark Twain?
Yeah, well, Helen John's book, Race for Citizenship, is really eye-opening in answering that question. But in my book, I talk about how like newspapers, like Black newspapers, kind of took on this rhetoric of calling the Chinese heathen Chinese. But like what was really kind of important about that, and what was different from like white people or white lawmakers taking that up, is, the Black writers were not saying that the Chinese are slaves, right? That they are kind of, that they weren't using that rhetoric. But at the same time, there was an attempt to kind of promote African-American fitness for citizenship that was different from the Chinese fitness for it. There are writers like Frances Harper, and there aren't like, I don't know, like significant characters, Chinese characters in those, but the idea of Chineseness as un-American and un-Christian does come up, like in Julia Cooper's writings. But someone like Frederick Douglass, made the argument that he was, opposing Chinese exclusions, using the argument that whatever happens to the Chinese, that the same thing is going to happen to us. So, we cannot be promoting Chinese exclusion because it's it'll really come back to us. So there are kind of moments of solidarity among African-American writers, but not so much as well. So kind of competing representations.
Let's see. Well, I think maybe we have time for one more question. There are so many good ones here, but this one is from Christine Ho, who asks, how does your book bring together or find contact points between the respective methods, approaches, and disciplines of African American studies and Asian American studies? And how did you reflect on their differences, and what paths forward do you see in bringing together these realms?
Oh, that's such a good question. And Christine, hi. This is a great question because this is actually what I'm going to be thinking about for my next project. So it's almost as if I've like planted this question. So thank you, Christine. So I really do want to think about the question more about contact points and methodology and the differences. In Asian American studies, there are quite a few scholars who engage in comparative work and looking at a comparative racialization of Asian Americans and African Americans. But the same isn't quite true in African American studies, where there's kind of this call for connections between Asian Americans and African Americans. So I, for my next project, I kind of want to sit on that a little bit and kind of think about that and think about what that means and what that means as we kind of move forward and continue to do this kind of comparative work and make connections and alliances.
Great, thank you so much for that, Caroline. I want to backpedal for 1 second, and the question that Esther raised previously was from Yamisi Gimo. Thank you for sharing the pronunciation of your name.
Thank you.
Oh yes, Yamisi, thank you. So good to see.
And yeah, as I said, there are a number of other really great questions here, but I think we should probably wrap it up. And I'm really grateful to Caroline and Esther for coming to talk to us today, Caroline for sharing this work with us. Thank you to the AAAS for setting up this virtual book fair. We as publishers are really grateful to have the opportunity to make sure that what we're putting out there is reaching all of you as readers. And thank you for attending today and taking the time to think together with us about this work. So I do want to just remind everyone that if you haven't already ordered your copy of Caroline's book, you can do so through the Stanford University Press website. There is even a discount code for 30% off. And as I mentioned before, we've been recording this, and so if there were people who can't attend, we can share that with them later. So yes, thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you so much, Esther. And thanks to all of you for attending. Take care, everyone. Stay safe and well. And please read the book and spread the word about it.
One more thing. So Sean Metzger is also participating in the virtual book fair, and his session is right after mine. So I hope you will all go to his book session as well. And thank you so much, Esther, for this wonderful, wonderful conversation, Margot for moderating, and everyone for showing up and tuning in. I can't wait to talk more with you about the book and hopefully see you in person one day soon. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Good to see everybody.
Thank you.